Journeys. Great to be here. I'm actually a law graduate, but that experience taught me very quickly that I probably wasn't cut out to be a lawyer. It's really nothing that's happened to me since has really changed that view. So I moved into the world of human resources, initially as a consultant, and a number of different HR roles, primarily in banking and finance, and then latterly in the legal profession. But I have been exposed to the law, of course, in different ways. I specialised in diversity, my first role in the mid-2000s in the UK, when the agenda was really growing fast there. And investment banking actually were big buyers of the business case. And really it started off with some massive litigation claims around sexual harassment and discrimination. But out of that grew a real genuine belief that diversity and inclusion really added value to the business, and that was a great place to start my practitioner work, and I haven't really left it since. Although when I came back to Australia, there weren't many diversity roles knocking around, which showed that kind of the gap really in terms of progress. Much has changed since then, fortunately. What I love about diversity work is the chance to try something different. I might just try and touch on that during the panel discussion if I can. It's about taking the organisation somewhere new. So the theme in my career is around culture change. As a practitioner, you spend a lot of time trying to build support for different propositions and interventions and initiatives. I've helped two organisations, National Australia Bank and now King Wood Mallesons, over the line in terms of adopting a gender target for its leadership and KWM's case partnership. A lot of stakeholder engagement and persuasion and influencing and making the case and having those tough conversations.
Thank you. Now we're going to broaden out to the whole panel. And the first big question is, what is the view of the panel regarding the impact of unconscious bias as a barrier to diversity within the profession? Does it go beyond gender, race and age?
There's no doubt unconscious bias is one of the most insidious and profound barriers that we face in making progress. It's not just about impacting the diversity of the demographic diversity and the composition of partnership or leadership teams. It's about the inclusion of the people at that table. So whilst you might have people of different backgrounds around the table, increasingly so, not nearly enough, but do the people around that table, are they empowered to contribute? Do their contributions get listened to and used? Or are decisions made in a different context in a male network somewhere outside that forum, so that actually when you have those discussions in the room, there is active exclusion going on, even though it may not be obvious. So for me, yeah, it cuts across everything, and it's one of the toughest barriers to tackle. But there are now, I think it's much better researched and understood, so there are now tools and resources, so I think that Duncan and Katie offer that will actually help us address that now.
And it's a great segue to Katie and Duncan to actually talk about some of those tools and resources.
Well, a great way to start is reading. Obviously, there's lots of great literature around unconscious bias now. There is a terrific author that we often refer to, Bina Candola, if you're interested, Kandola, Bina Candola, who is based in the UK. But if you're interested in learning about your own biases, if you would be curious to find out if you might have a bias towards seeing, in terms of leadership, do you see that as male or female? You can do what's called an implicit association test. It's through Harvard University. It's just a really simple online test. You can look at gender, you can look at age, see if you've got a bias towards older, younger workers. You can look at a whole range of areas. And it's just a simple computer-based test. It's a reaction time test. And you get to look at a number of images, and the reason that you're encouraged to respond quickly is to try and tease out your automatic assumptions. Because when we start to really think these through, we're going less likely to be biased. But it's a way of pulling out some of our automatic assumptions. So it's called the implicit association test. It's free. You can look it up on the web. But there are also some other, I guess, basic frameworks around refreshing our own leadership knowledge of the importance of perspective taking. And there are some very strong frameworks about really understanding, applying, suspending judgment and stepping into the other person's shoes. There's some simple frameworks around perspective taking. even and feedback, giving and receiving feedbacks. We often find that as we start to enter into this conversation around bias, we come back to some basic frameworks around perspective taking and giving and receiving feedback. And often what we do is just what's called an implementation intention plan. If we've learnt that if I have a bias, if I've learnt through my test I've got a bias towards people who work full-time, that's my bias. If I think they're the most effective people for my business, if I get that, then the next time that someone comes to me and says, oh, Katie, I'd like to work with you, but I'm only going to work I'd only like to work 3.5 days. One of the things we know is that if we start to be aware of our bias and can almost create a bit of an intention in our mind, we can actually challenge that bias and make sure we're making a fair and objective decision. It's a simple when-then statement. When someone comes to me and requests a flexible work arrangement, then I'm going to be aware of my bias towards full-time work, and I'm going to ensure that I read the flexible work policy, or whatever it is. It's a when-then. It's what's called an implementation intention plan. It's that intention planning. It's about refreshing it. You don't address these things overnight. You need to be constantly refreshed and seeking feedback from others. One of the characteristics of an inclusive leader is someone who is inviting feedback about their own assumptions, biases, behaviours, to ensure that they are creating that environment that Neil spoke about, that inclusive environment.
What's your view on the importance of inclusiveness? I'll start with Karen.
Look, I think the report found that inclusion really is the difference between a policy and outcomes. So this notion that, as we said before, you can have really great policies around diversity, you can even have diversity, physically reflected in your workplace, do all that sort of stuff right. But if people don't have a sense that their contribution is valued, and that, I think as Neil said, when you speak up, that those views are taken into account, that has a profound effect in terms of their sense of contribution to the workplace. I was just thinking, when Katie was talking, we ran the unconscious bias training in my workplace, and you can imagine for a bunch of human rights practitioners, it was slightly challenging. Why was I putting them through it? Because clearly we had all the right views in the room and all that sort of stuff. And I have to say, it was one of the things that came out of it was that real value of having a conversation, and people did contribute to the organisation in a way, I guess, that they hadn't before, in that there were a lot of assumptions that we made, that all of our staff were on board with all the messaging that we were talking about. And I do think that there were people within that group who actually felt not included because they were the white middle class male, no offence. And here were we, all our work, all our policies were about, an inclusive community. And there was a distinct group that came through, the three of them in the organisation, I have to say. There was a distinct group that came through saying that their voice wasn't being heard. And that was a really good lesson for us around, that notion that diversity is not just visible. It's not just about, looking at your stats and having you think about who you've got in the workplace. It really is actually having you think about how those voices are heard.
How important is establishing a clear business case for diversity and overcoming barriers and achieving change?
It's essential to get engagement. It depends what level of an organisation you're dealing with and what type of organisation you're dealing with. But if people don't understand the issue and why it's important, they're not going to engage with it. And sometimes this issue can be something that people feel quite uncomfortable about, particularly when you're in an industry that is predominantly one type of person, which we've been talking about. People don't understand the business case and why it matters, then they're not going to engage and embrace the change in conversation that needs to occur to do something about it.
Is gender target setting an effective strategy to achieve change?
I certainly think it can be. I think the effectiveness of targets rests in a number of things: the construct of the target, how you actually build support for that, and how you drive accountability for achieving the target. The target in itself will change nothing. It's a wrapper for a whole bunch of actions which need to be implemented at the kind of the coalface process level. The design of people processes, how they're constructed and how they actually applied in practice. So, how talent is identified, developed, promoted, etc. would be a great example, a critical example of that. And I think the accountability piece is particularly challenging in a law firm context. In a corporate context, perhaps a little easier because we normally typically have a whole bunch of mechanisms that already exist in terms of driving KPIs or objectives from the top, the CEO downwards, which everyone then gets a slice of. Well, that's less likely to be the case in a law firm. So the challenge around building support for a target and accountability for it is much more around the strength of the proposition, starting with the business case, and bringing people with you, bringing partners in particular with you, to see that they have a role to play in achieving that. It's more complex than one simple overarching target, but that's clearly where it starts. And what that does, I think, is drive focus. It drives a sense of urgency, and in a logical, analytical, data rational kind of organisation, such as law firms or indeed banks, having a number does make a big difference to how people perceive issues. And I've seen it make gender diversity in particular much more central to the business as a result, and engage people in the objective.